Welcome back. Pleased to have you with us once more on the More People podcasts. I'm your host, Andrew Fitzmaurice, joined today by Matthew Downs. Matthew, thanks for being with us.
Nice to be here.
So, Matthew, you're an IT director, associate director today for a business called Scala, but your career to date has centered primarily around IT. So there's lots of interesting things we're going to delve into, but a bit of your bio.
So I went to university in Kent, did computer science with a year in industry. And came out of that not entirely sure what I wanted to do. So I spent a little bit of time in insurance and realised I didn't want to do that. So moved across into supply chain and joined Procter & Gamble. And that was a really great start to my career. They were a great company, lots of personal development and threw responsibility at you right away. From there, moved to Weetabix, did a stint at Weetabix, working in a manufacturing environment, again, all supply chain, WMS implementations and production planning, that sort of thing. Went over and headed up their North American operations, which was basically a couple sites in the US and in Canada. We came back to the UK, and that's when I crossed over to the dark side, moved into the world of 3PLs. So I did 10 years, first with Fowler Welch, but then as it became part of Kalina Group within Kalina. And most recently, for the last 2-3 years, after 10 years in 3PL, I've moved into the murky world of consulting.
Having someone in the hot seat who is a subject matter expert in a few things, I thought I'd put you on the spot and start talking about AI, because it strikes me that it's incredibly topical, quite feared, I would think, across lots of people, and or we're starting to scratch the surface of how to actually implement it and use it in our businesses. I know very little about it, really. Your view, is AI new? Has it been around forever? What's your take on AI?
It's definitely an evolved thing. It's not just come about. I think the thing which everyone sort of thinks of as AI, ChatGPT, came on the scene in sort of 2017. But if you work backwards, machine learning, there's a lot of terms that have gone on for the last sort of 20 years or so, and it is definitely an evolution. But it has turned into a big thing. Obviously, 90% of US GDP growth in the last year has been AI-related spending. The electricity consumption in the US, based on data center usage, is 5% of total US electricity consumption, and that's going to be 10% by the time we get to the end of this decade, which is just sort of mind-blowing if you think about it. And I think an estimate from McKinsey Consulting said that by 2030, so again, the end of this decade, the spending on AI and IT-related infrastructure will be 6.7 trillion in capital globally. So is it a trend or is it a thing? Often gets called out, is this another blockchain? Is it a .com bubble? I think there's been a lot in the press recently, Bank of England saying, it's all going to crash at some point or another. I think obviously you can reflect on those two instances where there were hyped up, industries. But if you think blockchain, that became Bitcoin as one of the kind of components output of it. Bitcoin worth $113,000 today. The .com boom, it gave us the internet, and you just think how the world works differently with the advent of the internet. So is AI going to change how we work and how we live in the future? I think absolutely. Is it overhyped? Massively so, as kind of everyone jumps on the bandwagon.
So businesses will be starting to dip a toe in how to use it through things like ChatGPT or Copilot. What's your view on how businesses should be making use of it?
I think one of the things that people get confused with is kind of what are we talking about? What is AI? And it is a bit of a sort of blanket term, I think, isn't it? Which kind of encompasses a lot of different slants on artificial intelligence. So I think it's just worth sort of reflecting on kind of what the history is and then what it is. So I will answer your question, but if it's all right, maybe I'll take you there through a couple of backgrounds.
Please do.
The history, I guess, is if you think about machine learning and sort of technology development, you've got this huge amount of sort of computing power and storage, but you don't really know where it is. And that sort of disconnection between where the infrastructure is and what capacity it's got, and my need to do some computing, has really sort of enabled and turbocharged this round of AI, of machine learning. The second piece, and the ChatGPT connection, is the internet. So again, if you wind back, we're old enough with a few grey hairs to think, prior to sort of the internet as we know it today, where did you get information? It was from contacts, libraries, that sort of thing. Now you've just got this enormous wealth of information online. And thinking about things like newspapers, journals, going back years, medical, documents, just the sheer amount of kind of high quality verbal text that's out on the internet that's accessible as kind of content to train these. And that brings me on to, what is AI? What is this round of AI? So you hear ChatGPT sort of thrown around a lot. It's a large language model. And that's a little acronym that doesn't do large justice. It's one of these terms that actually it's enormous. So ChatGPT, GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. So generative means you can use it to create new content. We all know about that, creating stupid pictures on ChatGPT, or getting school kids, getting it to create homework for them based on a question. The pre-trained is all that content from the internet. And the transformer is the clever bit. That's the machine learning piece. It's trained on 60 trillion words. So if you put that into sort of human speak, what does that mean? If you were setting about to read 60 trillion words at a sort of normal adult reading pace, that would take you about 4 million years, working 365 days a year and 8 hours a day. Essentially what it does is it goes through a process of kind of digesting all of that content in order of the words that appear. And each word, they're called tokens in the sort of large language model speak, is basically assigned values. That they in the terminology they call it sort of multi-dimensional values, but that all makes it sound a bit Star Trek. There's actually nothing clever going on. It's essentially a whole pile of attributes to do with a word. So if I gave you an example, fashion model or physics model, that word model has a number of meanings, all depends on the words around it, kind of before and after. So what I start to do is I give those words attributes. It's related to this, it's in the future tense, it's got a gender, it's got a color. So what the training does is it goes through all of this content, looks at the words before, looks at the words after, and effectively tries to determine what the next most likely word would be in the context that it sits in. When it then adds that word, it goes through the whole process again.
So kind of like a set of simultaneous equations to iterate
exactly
where
that.
it's going.
Yeah. So if you think about it of a kind of mathematical process, you've got all these words with all these attributes. And effectively, you've trained that model to say, right, I know what word should come next sat in this context. I'll add that word, and then I'll go through the process again and say, what should the next word be? So when you go to ChatGPT and you say, ChatGPT, make me a poem about this, that, or the other, what you're doing is that text is acting like a primer. With that set of words, what would a reasonable set of words be in response? But you can see why it gets these characteristics of being unpredictable, with that amount of training, those amount of variables, and the primer being slightly different every time. You ask a question, I ask a question, just how we form it will generate a different output. makes it very unpredictable.
In a world where we're all trying to be a lot greener and a lot more efficient, is there an issue with its energy consumption without realizing that we're burning all this energy?
I think there's been a huge investment in data centers, and it's kind of ongoing at the moment and sort of spiraling or escalating, partly in response to that sort of space race. Nobody wants to get left behind. And the training for these models is the bit that's taking a big chunk of that sort of IT processing power, but also then all the queries that you're running against this model to kind of generate this new output. So there's definitely, a footprint to all of that. But interestingly, it's spawning a new sort of industry in its own right. I was reading an article the other day saying companies like Rolls-Royce in the UK, not normally associated with power generation. They build small nuclear reactors to go into submarines, all part of the, sort of defense infrastructure. They're looking at those as solutions for, powering data centers as a kind of modular, power in a box type thing. So, it's going to be an interesting future there. And it's important, I guess, that it's got a green thought process going on, because it's going to need to, with the amount of energy that it's going to consume.
I'm always curious with the people who rely very heavily on ChatGPT, whether there's a loss of skills because you just blindly put stuff in and accept what comes back without any sort of filter on whether it's correct or understood. So I wonder whether one of the pitfalls of the dumbing down is, quite a salient concern.
I couldn't tell you where this quote comes from, but I know they've done a study on ChatGPT and the critical analysis of its responses, like analyzing the brain patterns. And people who ask a question, get a response from ChatGPT, don't challenge the response in it as though it was from a friend. Yeah. It's the same sort of brain activity from a trusted source. So you're absolutely right, that ability to critique it. And I think, in fact, right back to your original question, which was, how do people start to engage with this stuff beyond more kind of trivial playing around with it? I think it's definitely a skill to learn, knowing what question am I asking and how do I sort of tease out the answer that I need? Again, I'm sure you remember going back to Google search, and, when that first became a thing, people had to learn, how do I search this? Do I want to go past the first page? That whole thing. How do I vet what I'm looking at? What is a reliable source? All those things that we learned that we now just take for granted. We're going to have to do the same thing with AI and tools like ChatGPT. One of the interesting things about ChatGPT is it actually starts to learn off your questions and the questions that you ask after the questions you've asked. So starts to build up a history of, what you're interested in and what your sort of worldview is to inform future answers. So you can never really start that process too soon. It's a case of trying the tools and sort of getting familiar with them. There's a lot out there, lots of tools out there. ChatGPT is the obvious one. A lot of people don't realize that Microsoft Copilot is actually ChatGPT kind of behind the scenes. Scala, we're thinking about, how's this going to affect the consulting industry? If I can just type in, how do I design a warehouse that can contain these many pallets?
What would a consultant do?
What would a consultant do? So we're working on that ourselves, trying to familiarize ourselves with the tools that are out there to become those trusted parties who can help guide companies through the sort of process of adoption. And one of the tools that we've come across, which is really good for research and that sort of thing, is called Perplexity. And it's another large language model, a bit like ChatGPT, but does a much better job of quoting its sources. So ChatGPT does use trusted sources. And in fact, where it's getting content from forums, it sort of downgrades that. If you ask a question it doesn't know, and it's not like it's thinking, it's generating content, but it will flag, this might not be a fact, it could be an opinion, but, this is where I've got it from. Perplexity does a really good job of that in terms of, here's the response, but this has come from this source, that's come from that source. And so you can start to play that that more analytical game of, do I trust what I'm being told?
There's so much to unpack. We could talk all day about it. There's definitely work to do, and with all these challenges comes opportunities. So, look, it's been great to scratch the surface of it, Matt, and further investigation and more reading and more trial and error, I think, is required.
Yes, definitely. Yes, no, never too soon to start.